two speakers. A wealth of information shared there about different views and how the world is looked at. Interesting, I started wondering whether I was in an anti-PPP session or a post-MDG financing session. So maybe I'll respond to that side first and then I'll come to the indigenous peoples. That's not in any way dismissing the PPP discussion. I'm reminded of my early experiences where I spent 15 years living and working with poor people in Africa. And actually, the two biggest things that impacted upon rural livelihoods in Africa, the single ploughshare, bullet-drawn ploughshare, metal ploughshare, and maize, distributed throughout Africa without a single public sector involvement. That was all private sector. So I think that if I translate it to my time here in the ADB, at the board, there is no clear single instruction at the board telling the bank to push public-private partnerships over and above anything else. In fact, the bulk of the investment into infrastructure comes from the public sector investments in the bank, if you look at the data. And I think it's important to bear in mind, these are a means to an end. And if you look at the evaluative evidence, the vast bulk of public, sovereign spent loans of ADB into infrastructure work, the evaluative evidence shows a tremendous failing on sustainability. So the PPP model is just one of those approaches being designed to try and fix one of that issue. I'm not saying it's a perfect solution, and it's very context specific. And I think the issue comes down to the quality of the investment and the design behind it, and the regulations that the societies have themselves. And that brings me to a core point, which is it's remarkably easy for NGOs to focus on an MDG with their lobbying messages. But actually, a lot of the issue is the tension with the domestic policies and laws and regulations. And that brings me to the indigenous people. The ADB accountability mechanism and the panel has, as you know, recently been reviewed, and there's a new policy. And it actually works quite well. Probably amongst the MDBs, it's one of the best, I would suggest. I'm a bit biased because I'm the chair of the Board Compliance Review Committee, which is, I guess, my selective career to be up here in the firing line. There is a real tension in that country systems are not at the same standard as the ADB systems. And ADB does require that its investments follow ADB standards. And of course, that doesn't always work, and that's where complaints kick in. And ADB standards aren't based on whether the country itself defines indigenous people or not. It's based on its own analyses. In a recent case that we've been looking at, it was clear that unwittingly there was trust put on studies done by the country concerned using the country system standards, and those weren't up to ADB standards. And therefore that project came to a complaint. That complaint was upheld, and there's been a very tortuous process. It's the first complaint to come through the new policy, and actually the case has been upheld, and the complainant's a action plan has to be brought to the board to fix that issue. So I think the system does work very well, but ultimately the pressure will be to move more and more to country systems. That debate hasn't gone away. If we look at post-MDG, of course inequality is going to remain, the impacts of climate change are going to be there, the way growth tends to get fueled are going to lead to greater and greater levels of harmful emissions, which are fueling the climate change issue. There will continue to be poverty at work, which is a big issue for you guys, of course. There'll be resource constraints. So the demand for an NGB working post-MDG is clearly going to be there. But that tension is also going to be there in that countries are increasingly going to say, why aren't you using our country systems? So that really raises a fundamental question for the MDBs and the NGO partnership, which is where actually should be the focus of your attention in lobbying? It's really easy to turn to ADB and embarrass the president and force him to then tell the department to do something slightly different. Of course, that's what I do on the board. I'm doing it all the time. But actually, it's much more difficult to focus your efforts in the country